Chapter 7. When I woke up the next day, I felt wonderfully warm. Then I remembered why I was so warm. I opened my eyes and looked down at Timothy's tied wrists and his arms on either side of me. Then I looked at the cramped wagon crammed full of people. Now that it was daylight and sunlight was pouring in through the cracks of the wagon, I could see that this space was very much the same size as a small elevator. I must have jerked because suddenly Timothy moved too. Other people were stirring as well. The walls were caked with dirt, as if this wagon had been used to haul compost or animals, and dust shook out of the wooden planks with every little vibration. I started to cough. "Are you all right?" Timothy asked me. I tested my breathing. It was a little rapid, but the oxygen flow seemed adequate. "I think so." "Good," he said, bringing his arms over my head, because my arms are asleep. Free for the first time in hours, I sat up and away from his body. I was immediately cold. I shivered and by accident looked at Richard. He and Timothy both had 2 days of stubble, but somehow Richard wasn't pulling off that rugged, too-cool-to-shave look. It didn't help that he still had a sour expression on his face. "Good morning, sunshine," he said. "I guess you survived the night." "Richard?" "Yes?" "You snore." Very loudly. There was a pounding on the side of the wagon as Oswald's voice rang out. "Everyone awake in there?" The door was thrown open and we were ordered out. I jumped up before anyone else. "Ladies first." I tripped and stumbled over feet and legs as I made my way to the wagon's door until my rope went taut. Richard, still on the floor, complained loudly. "Hey, you may be betrothed to Timothy, but you're tied to me, remember?" I yanked on the rope. "Come on, what are you waiting for?" He got to his feet. "You're the one with the paranoia, sweetheart, not me." But when I got to the door and saw Oswald grinning up at me, I hesitated. Instinctively I drew back, but he grabbed my arm and said, Now, don't be afraid of old Uncle Oswald. Not yet, anyway." He pulled me out. As I landed on the forest floor, Oswald reached out and touched my hair, entangling it in his fingers. I recoiled, but he didn't let go. He held on to me until everyone had climbed out of the wagon. "Now listen up. I don't have enough men to guard every one of you, or go chasing you down the river if you decide not to cooperate. So instead, I'm going to offer you an incentive. If every one of you comes back to the wagon tonight, then nothing happens to the girl. I don't lose either way." We were each given a chunk of black bread, but not any water. Oswald promised our group that when they began to swim, they'd get all the water they wanted to drink. We ate on foot, all of us glad for the chance to stretch. As I munched on my dry bread, eating it as slowly as I couldn't help but feel responsible for this unnecessary, prolonged dunking. Maybe it was time to confess to Timothy that I hadn't actually thrown the seal in the river. Once he knew the truth, I could leave it up to him to decide if he wanted to hand it over to Oswald or not. Besides, after last night, I suppose I owed him a favor. I edged over to Timothy's side. Trying not to draw attention, I made my voice as quiet as I could. "About last night." A patronizing expression came over his face. "I know," he said, keeping his voice low but sounding a little too patient. "You want to tell me that you're grateful, but that it doesn't mean anything. Don't worry, Lisbette. I was just trying to keep you quiet so everyone else could go to sleep." "You were—" I grappled with the words he had just spoken. "You were trying to keep me quiet?" At that moment, I didn't know if I was more disappointed or angry. Then I knew. I was angry. "Yes, I was grateful, but beyond that, I can see that your imagination has been working overtime. Mean anything? What would it mean? You know, I hope you have a good time swimming in that icy cold river today. I'm going to enjoy the thought of you freezing." Then I stood up on my toes and whispered into his good ear and said, "But you know what the really funny thing is? That box isn't even in the river." That jolted him. "What?" I was happy to see him properly shocked. Again, I leaned near him, only this time he leaned closer too. "That's right," I hissed in his ear. "Do you really think I'd throw irreplaceable property belonging to the king into the river?" "But—" "I hid that stupid box in a hollow stump on the riverbanks and marked it so that I could find it again. But I'm not telling you how I marked it, so don't get any ideas." I don't know what I was expecting, but I didn't expect him to smile. He beamed down at me with a look of such ultimate satisfaction that I felt my small victory slipping from my fingers. In a last attempt to save my advantage, I whispered, "But I'm not telling you where. Don't even bother asking me, you thief." Richard was watching us. How could he not be curious when Timothy was standing there looking so smug? I turned to Richard and said, "And I hope your toes turn black and fall off today." Still, after they cut me from the group and I was forced to watch them all march away from me toward the river, I felt that even Richard's company would have been preferable to being left alone in the camp. My rope now attached to the spoke of the wagon wheel. I was not completely alone, but left under the guard of 2 women who sat bleary-eyed beside a campfire not far from the wagon. They mostly grumbled to each other about the weather and the mud, but at least they had chairs. At last I got tired of standing, and I sat down on a pile of wet bracken, which seemed better to me than the mud. I picked up a stick and started amusing myself by breaking it into small pieces. Keeping me quiet, I fumed inwardly. What did I care about any of them getting sleep? I was supposed to be nearly home by now, but instead I was tied to this wagon, all because of that stupid seal that should never have been in this part of the country in the first place. Then I thought about how happy Timothy had seemed when he found out I hadn't actually chucked the seal into the river. As far as I was concerned, he didn't deserve 1 iota of good news. If I hadn't been so mad, I might have had the good sense to keep my mouth shut. The morning dragged by. Sometimes some of the robbers would come back and have a cup of coffee and complain about how tedious it was to watch over the prisoners as they took turns searching the riverbed. Then they'd laugh about how cold the prisoners were when they finally came out of the water. I picked up another stick and broke it into pieces. Late in the afternoon, the robbers began to come back, bringing with them the soldiers from George's unit. One by one, they were reattached to the same long rope that had kept me by the wagon all day. I tried not to look too close at any of them. When I did, I couldn't help but writhe with guilt. All of them were pale, drawn, and shivering. Even Richard, when he was brought back, seemed too dispirited to say anything sarcastic to me. When George showed up, he had the nerve to look concerned as soon as he saw me. "Are you all right?" he asked, his teeth chattering. "Of course I'm all right," I snapped. "I wasn't out there swimming in the freezing water, remember? Can't they even give you blankets? What are they trying to do? Kill you all slowly by letting you catch pneumonia?" I looked over his shoulder and made a face. "What's taking Timothy so long?" "They must have taken him further downriver to dive," George replied, clasping his hands tight against his chest to keep warm. "I wouldn't be so sure about that," Richard said, his shoulders all hunched up to his ears. George looked sharply at Richard. "Why would you say that?" Richard stopped to wipe his nose on the back of his sleeve and then, "Because no one went further down the river than I did." "So what are you saying?" I asked. He blew on his fists and sneered at me over his purple knuckles. "Nothing. Only that whatever you were telling Timothy this morning might have made him think twice about coming back here tonight." I felt the air go out of me as if someone had punched me in the stomach. "He wouldn't leave me here." Richard smiled in a nasty kind of way. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing that would make him leave me," I said, but the words sounded uncertain. "He wouldn't leave me, would he? Not when Oswald had threatened to hurt me if everyone didn't come back. He couldn't possibly want the seal that badly, could he?" "I didn't think Timothy was that kind of man," George said, "though I suppose anyone who would steal from his king could turn against a friend." "No," I said, my voice sounding small, "he wouldn't do that." "Listen," George said to Richard, "what are we going to do if he doesn't come back?" "Do?" Richard asked. "What can we do? Timothy fooled every last one of us. He's taken off knowing full well what would happen if he didn't show up again tonight." He turned to me. "And whatever does happen, you just remember that Timothy did this to you, and there's not a thing any of us can do about it." I pivoted toward the river. It wasn't true. Any moment now, Timothy would walk through those woods and join with the rest of us. But as the seconds turned to minutes, a sickening panic began to build up inside of me. When someone did appear, it wasn't Timothy. It was Oswald. We all watched him as he went to the fire, took a cup of coffee from one of the women, and then carried it over to where we stood. He looked us over, counting us with his eyes. Then he snorted, "One missing. Now isn't that sad?" His cold eye fell on me. "Clive, cut her loose." "What are you going to do to her?" George demanded. Oswald took a sip from his coffee. "I'm not going to kill her, if that's what you're worried about. The rest of you came back today, I'm assuming, because of her. I'll need the same incentive for tomorrow."